On a cold April evening in 1812, on the approaches to this formidable fortress, thousands of Britain's notorious Redcoats crept in silence. Their objective? To scale 3 breaches hacked into the city's defences by enormous siege cannon, and to wrestle one of the key strongholds from Napoleon's forces occupying Spain. That fight, destined to go down in history as one of the bloodiest episodes of the Peninsular War, was a short but ferocious one, with men falling by the hundred in the attempts to gain these walls. Within just a few hours, the fight was over, only to be replaced by a new horror as a brutal retribution was unleashed by the attackers. In this video, using the latest technology to view and understand the battlefield like never before, and with the words of those who survived that hellish night, we'll recreate the events which history remembers as the Storming of Badajoz. By April 1812, right here on Europe's Iberian Peninsula, forces led by Marshal Napoleon Bonaparte's Grande Armée were locked in a brutal conflict against an alliance of Spanish, Portuguese and British forces which had already raged for 4 years at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. Now though, with Portugal liberated, the most prominent Allied commander, Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, was finally ready to launch a strike to drive the French from occupied Spain. By exploring the modern map, we can understand Wellesley's situation a little better. If his troops were to advance into the country, liberate Madrid and force the French back across the Pyrenees, he absolutely had to hold 2 key roads, known rightly as the Keys to Spain. The first, to the north, running from the Portuguese border to the key city of Salamanca, was barred by this, the fortress town of Ciudad Rodrigo. Well-sited, modern star fort bristling with guns, it dominated the Salamanca road, and simply, for progress to be made, it had to fall. The second key location, some 80 miles to the south, was this road, running through the heartlands of Spain, directly to Madrid itself. It was astride this route that the even more formidable fortified city of Badajoz lay. Despite knowing exactly what Wellesley must do, the French were still caught off guard when on the 7th of January, in bitter winter storms, Anglo-Portuguese troops who should have been sheltering in winter billets appeared over these hills to surround the garrison of Ciudad Rodrigo. 12 days of siege followed, which saw thousands of round shots slam into the city's walls just here, before a short but extremely bloody assault was launched at 2 main breaches under cover of darkness on the 19th. In just a few hours it was over, the French garrison defeated, and the town, which still to this day bears many scars of that fight, was in Allied hands. And so, with Ciudad Rodrigo taken, the coalition's attention turned south to the far sterner test to follow at Badajoz. A look at the battlefield today gives us some idea of the task facing Wellesley and the Anglo-Portuguese coalition. Badajoz was extremely well defended, with the broad Guadiana River protecting the northernmost approaches, the smaller Revilla's tributary guarding the east, and the fortress itself with robust walls studded with 8 bastions covering all sides. With modern LiDAR technology, we can get even closer to the Badajoz of 1812. Removing the modern cityscape and peeling back the layers of history to better understand what kind of ground these men were fighting over. Beginning in the northeast corner, we find the city's castle, the oldest part of the defences, perched upon a natural rocky outcrop. At the foot of those slopes, the Revilla stream flows northwards to the mighty Guadiana. The Revillas would be dammed by the French defenders in the lead up to the battle, flooding the area beyond the city's southeastern walls, making an assault here extremely difficult. On the northern bank lies the Fort Tête du Pont, a substantial work guarding the single ancient bridge crossing the river, which still stands today as one of the city's most famous sites. Back with LiDAR, here on the high ground to its east, Fort San Cristobal can also be identified. As we continue rotating around the fortress, the San Vicente bastion comes into view in the northwest corner, returning back towards our starting point, the southern bastions of the Santa Maria and Trinidad. It was in these locations that the most bitter fighting would take place. And finally, outside the main defences, the outworks. Fort Picurina to the south, along with the Pardaleras and San Roque Lunet across the Revillas. These later additions to the defence works served to deny prominent high ground from which breaching batteries could assault the main town walls. In short, for Badajoz to fall, the outworks must first be carried. If all went to plan and the coalition could overcome those defences, the task was still not over. The old town was a tightly knit maze of streets and alleys, and the assailants would need to battle through these if they were to take the city. This was the nut the coalition would have to crack if they were to succeed in Spain. In command of the French garrison was this man, Major General Armand Philippon. A seasoned soldier, Philippon was regarded as one of the most formidable fortress commanders in Europe. At his side was Colonel Lemaire, his engineer-in-chief, responsible for shoring up the French defences in the face of the coming assault. Nearby, Marshals Soult and Marmont each had an army in the field, though their inability to reach Badajoz in time to break the siege would be a decisive feature of the battle. Wellesley, then Earl of Wellington, headed the British and Portuguese troops. The Battle of Waterloo was still 3 years away, but he was already a famed commander and one of the British Army's key assets in the peninsula. Wellesley had 7 divisions with him at Badajoz, 3 of which would make the broad ring facing outwards to protect against Marmont or Soult's attempts to raise the siege. That left 4 divisions, or approximately 12,000 men, to conduct the siege proper. The main assault would come from the 4th and Light Divisions, led by Sir Charles Colville, a Scottish veteran of actions in Egypt and the Caribbean, and Lieutenant General Charles Alton, respectively. Subsidiary attacks, in effect diversionary and not designed to breach the city's walls, would come from General Picton's 3rd and Leith's 5th Divisions. What about the men doing the fighting? Let's meet a few. First, there's Private William Brown of the 45th 1st Nottinghamshire Regiment of Foot. Serving in Picton's fighting 3rd Division, Brown would be in the thick of the action around the castle. Close by was Sergeant Joseph Donaldson, a Glaswegian who ran away to sea in search of adventure and fortune, but who eventually found himself serving with the 94th Foot in the peninsula. And then there was Bugler Bill Green from Lutterworth in Leicestershire. Green had been in the army since 1805 and had served throughout the Peninsular campaign. He was with Alton's Light Division at Badajoz and would be amongst the troops assaulting the main breaches. All 3 men came from very different backgrounds, but each leaves us with a fascinating primary source in the form of their own accounts of the battle. We'll be hearing from all 3 as the action unfolds. Siege warfare was no new development at Badajoz. This would be the 3rd time the city had been put under siege in a little over a year. Marshal Soult successfully took the town from the Spanish in March 1811, and Philippon held it in the face of British and Portuguese forces between April and June. This time, Wellesley hoped things would be different. He would take personal charge of the attack. By March the 16th, his force and crucially his heavy artillery had arrived, crossing the Guadiana to begin the siege. By turning once again to a historic map overlaid on the modern satellite image, we can understand the progression of events. The first parallels or trenches seen here were installed to the southeast, following the line of the old French works. Along these parallels, the first breaching batteries were installed, heavy guns used to smash great gaps in the walls of the Picarina fort here. But the main assault force would attack from the south, just like Soult had done, successfully the year before. As they made their preparations, the weather, which had been largely fine, took a turn for the worse, deluging troops with rain. But the weather wasn't the only issue facing the attackers. On March the 19th, and showing considerable spirit, French forces sallied out with 1,500 infantry and 40 cavalry charging the troops constructing the siege works beyond the Badajoz walls. The coalition lost 150 men and a large quantity of crucial siege stores such as spades and picks before the attack was forced back. If this was a setback for Wellesley though, it was only a temporary one, as just 6 days later, Picton's troops were to assault the Picarina. In a short but bloody affair, the fort was carried by an assault across this very ground. Today only a small remnant of the imposing fort which once stood on this spot can be seen, nestled in a peaceful park in the suburbs of Badajoz. So, with the Picarina taken, the coalition could finally bring the full force of their artillery down on the city walls. Again, the historic map overlay provides us with unique insight. We see that once the Picarina fell, these batteries, marked J and Y, could be installed and from the 31st of March used to methodically chip away at the defences. Eventually, it would be these artillery pieces that punched the main breaches into the Trinidad and Santa Maria bastions. It should be noted that these breaches were not simple holes in the city walls. They were effectively steep rubble slopes, in this case some 30 feet in height, which attacking infantry would need to traverse in order to gain access to the town. A little further along the same parallel, 4 smaller batteries laid down harassing fire on the eastern face of the Trinidad, the San Roque Bastion, and right here at the castle, smashing French defences, dismounting guns and causing widespread casualties. By April the 6th, though, 3 significant breaches had been blasted into the walls here at the Santa Maria, in this face of the Trinidad, and a third last-minute breach between the 2 bastions here. These would be the targets for the 4th and Light Divisions. Colonel Lemaire described the chaos among the French positions at Badajoz, and the desperate attempts to plug those gaps. Death was dealt at every direction amongst us. The ramparts were crumbling to pieces, the breaches becoming practicable, and the efforts which our workmen made nightly to clear them were ineffectual. In this state of things, a council of defence was assembled to make the last arrangements. But what sort of preparations were being made by the defenders at Badajoz? Firstly, a series of ditches and earth ramparts were dug along the base of the main wall, which the assault parties would use to navigate their way to the breaches. One of those ditches was flooded with water from the Revias to increase the difficulty of an advance, while another had been mined with barrels of gunpowder and flammable material. Perhaps even more horrifying was what waited the attackers in the breaches themselves. Lemaire and his men had largely cleared the rubble from the bombardment, giving them a clear line of sight on their assailants. Within those cleared avenues lay planks of wood studded with metal spikes, ready to tear the flesh of the assailants. When the attack commenced, the defenders would block the breaches with chevaux de frise, hundreds of sword blades studded into a central wooden beam, completely blocking each breach at its summit. These were traditionally anti-cavalry devices, but they would be grimly effective against Wellesley's infantry too. To top off the defences, the largest of the breaches was also covered by a battery of French artillery pieces dug in here in an enfilade position and loaded with canister shot. This battery would open up at point-blank range when the assault began, showering the attackers with barrel after barrel of musket balls. Around 1/4 of the French manpower at Badajoz, more than 1,000 men, was also stationed at the southwest corner of the city, each with multiple preloaded muskets, ready to add their own fire to the storm of shot and shell. Wellesley might have felt he had the upper hand, but Philippon, Lemaire, and their men were certainly not going down without a fight. At 7:30 p.m. on April the 6th, the siege guns fell silent, their work complete. Now the defenders would see just how effective their preparations had been. The attack was coming. Let's recap. So the main breaches were here in these 3 locations. They were to be the primary focus of the assaults by the 4th and Light Divisions, who were expected to gain the town. These main attacks would follow Picton's 3rd Division, who were to mount their own diversionary ladder-borne assault or escalade against this section of wall, designed to draw the defenders away from the breaches and towards the castle. Waiting in reserve to the southwest was Leith's 5th Division, who could also be used to launch another escalade against the San Vicente Bastion if needed. The first assault began at 9:40 p.m. The lunette of San Roque fell quickly, and as the cathedral bell rang out for 10 p.m, Picton's 3rd Division crossed the Revias and made for the castle wall. The fighting 3rd immediately met heavy resistance. Amid withering crossfire from the bastions at either side, they succeeded in placing 5 ladders against the wall, but few troops were able to scale them as barrel loads of musket balls scoured them clean of attackers. Sergeant Donaldson was there and remembered those moments. When the ladders were placed, each eager to mount crowded them in such a way that many of them broke, and the poor fellows who had nearly reached the top were precipitated a height of 30 or 40 feet and impaled on the bayonets of their comrades below. Other ladders were pushed aside by the enemy on the walls and fell with a crash on those in the ditch, while more who got to the top without accident were shot on reaching the parapet and tumbling headlong brought down those beneath them. Picton himself was wounded in the attempt, and General James Kempt assumed command, withdrawing the survivors some distance. The 3rd had neither taken the castle nor diverted Philippon's troops from the breaches. To their south, the main assault began its advance. In contrast to the carnage poured down on the comrades in the 3rd, the 4th and Light Divisions encountered little difficulty in their approach. The French, fully aware of what was going on, simply waited. Recounting the action of that night, bugler Bill Green will remark upon the eerie stillness of the advance. But once their quarry had reached the water-filled ditch beneath the breaches, all hell broke loose. That hell was principally directed at the men of the Forlorn Hope, a group of sacrificial and incredibly courageous volunteers whose job was to scale the breaches ahead of the main body, trip any mines and force the defenders to fire their muskets so that the main assault force would have a clearer path to their objective. Only a handful of the Hope would survive that night. Bugler William Green was one. He recalled the experience. A ball went through the thick part of my thigh, and having my bugle in my left hand, it entered my left wrist, and I dropped, so I didn't get into the ditch. I scarcely felt the ball go through my thigh, but when it entered my wrist, it was more like a 6-pounder than a musket ball. It smashed the bone and cut the guides, and as the blood was pouring from both wounds, I began to feel very faint. Our men were in the ditch, while the enemy had shells loaded on top of the wall about 2 yards apart. As they were fired, they rolled into the ditch, and as they burst, 10 or 12 men were blown in every direction. The following waves fared no better, with men cut down in swathes by musket and canister shot in this small patch of ground. Time and time again, the 4th and Light, reinforced by troops from the rear, attempted desperate attacks, but were drowned in the blood-soaked ditch at the foot of the breach, or skewered on blades and cut down by sweeping musket fire on its slopes. Those few who reached the chevaux de frise may have glimpsed amassed beyond rank after rank of French troops in staunch defence, but no man that night would live to recall it. From Wellesley's vantage point to the southeast, he could see the attack faltering. He watched on as his men were cut down in their scores. Reports filtered back, officers killed, heaps of casualties choking the breaches, French defences standing firm. James McGrigor, the Inspector General of Hospitals, who was with Wellington, recalled. Another officer came up with a still unfavourable report. No progress had been made, and he feared none could be made, for almost all the officers were killed and none left to lead on the men, of whom a great many had fallen. As the main assault stalled, the battle plan shifted. The subsidiary attacks, intended merely as diversions, would need to play a far more pivotal role. Here at Badajos' northeastern corner, the 3rd Division, still reeling from the horror at the castle wall, resumed its advance. Colonel Ridge's 5th Brigade made for a potential weak point missed in the initial chaos. By an astonishing stroke of good fortune, on a hitherto luckless night, Ridge's brigade met only with limited resistance. Though equipped with just 2 ladders, Ridge and half a company scaled the wall and after a short but bloody hand-to-hand fight entered the castle compound right here. Ridge's luck would not last, as the sight of British troops fanning out along the ramparts cheered those coming up in reserve. The colonel and his vanguard were engaged by French infantry along these walls. Ridge was wounded in the encounter. He would not survive the night. Despite the loss of their commander, the 5th Brigade was able to push on. As more men from Picton's 3rd Division poured over the walls, the castle was taken, with one member of the 3rd famously running his red tunic up the flagpole to signal their success. But the battle was far from won. Picton's men could do little more than hold the fortification. The exits from the castle, seen here as they look today, were too few and too narrow for the 3rd Division to drive further into Badajoz. The killing blow would need to come from elsewhere. Shortly after 11 p.m, Leith's 5th Division, waiting in reserve on the Cerro del Viento, received their orders and, perhaps more importantly, their ladders. The 5th were never supposed to enter the town at all, but with the 3rd Division pinned down in the castle and the assaults on the breaches being bloodily repulsed, the fate of the storming lay in their hands. It was around midnight when Leith's men reached the San Vicente bastion. Taking heavy fire, the 5th pressed on across the ditch and scaled the wall. Led by Major General Walker, they forced the enemy from the walls, broke free of the hitherto impregnable defences and finally began to advance into the town. Assailed from 3 sides and crucially outflanked at the San Vicente, the situation soon became untenable for the defenders at the breaches. With British bugle calls sounding in their rear, the French began a chaotic retreat, abandoning their positions in the southeast. The 4th and Light, shattered and traumatised by the brutal fighting at the Trinidad and Santa Maria bastions, began yet another assault with any troops who remained fit to fight. This time they were successful, and finally Colville and Alton's troops summited the deserted breaches and they too advanced into the city. Now inside Badajoz, the remnants of those divisions traversed the labyrinthine streets uneasily. Captain Edward Hopkins remembered lights in the windows, watchers in the shadows, and guns fired from door sills that dropped men in the streets. As they approached the castle, the men yelled out and sent up bugle calls into the night air. When those calls were answered by the 3rd Division, holed up in the castle, all understood the battle was over. It was 2 a.m. by the time the 4th, 5th and Light Divisions linked up with Pictons at the castle. Most of the French troops who could now fled, retreating north across this very bridge to seek safety in the remaining forts on the north bank of the Guadiana. Many others, 1,500 all told, would perish in the fight or in the ruthless carnage that was about to unfold as the bloodied but victorious Allied survivors sought retribution for the hell they'd endured in the breaches. The immediate aftermath of the storming was utterly brutal. Before the siege began, many of the Spanish inhabitants had been allowed to flee, but perhaps as many as 1,500 remained behind. Those who did were now caught up in the rampage as British troops, with their blood up, scoured the town for alcohol, women, plunder, and the enemy. Chaos erupted as the few remaining officers lost control, and Redcoats ran down these streets, blasting locks from doors, smashing windows, and killing anyone who offered resistance. Captain William Blakeney witnessed those events. Every house presented a scene of plunder, debauchery, and cruelty. Men, women, and children were shot in the streets for no other apparent reason than pastime. Ned Costello of the 95th also remembered the night. The shouts and oaths of drunken soldiers in the quest of more liquor, the reports of firearms and crashing in of doors, together with the appalling shrieks of hapless women, might have induced anyone to believe himself in the region of the damned. By dawn, with Badajoz still ablaze, Wellesley declared, "It is now full time that the plunder of Badajoz should cease." It did not. In fact, it continued unabated until at 11 p.m. on April the 8th, more than 2 full days after the storm had begun, Wellesley issued a general order. A roll call would be conducted in all camps every hour until all men were accounted for, with any man found in the act of plunder to be executed on the spot. Once the chaos finally dwindled, the Allied casualties lay largely where they'd fallen. Surgeon Walter Henry was appalled by what he saw at the breaches and here at the foot of the southeastern wall. There lay a frightful heap of 1,400 or 1,500 British soldiers, many dead but still warm, mixed with the desperately wounded to whom no assistance could be given. There lay the burned and blackened corpses of those who died in the explosions, mixed with those that were torn to pieces by round shot or grape and killed by musketry. Body piled upon body, intermixed into one hideous and enormous mass. Wellesley had his victory, and the coalition forces had taken their prize, but the human toll had been enormous. All told, more than 4,600 of his men had been killed or wounded in the taking of Badajoz, with 3,700 of them coming in the storming alone. No wonder then that when the general arrived at this very spot, where once those breaches stood, and surveyed the ground upon which many of his finest soldiers had fallen, he openly wept at the devastation before him. Today, the site of the worst of the slaughter shows little sign of what once took place here, with the walls repaired and this peaceful park now marking the final resting place of more than 1,000 Redcoats, buried where they fell, who were destined never to leave Badajoz. For the rest, including Sergeant Donaldson and Private Green, both of whom were wounded but lived, the fight went on, and within 2 months Wellesley's men were engaged in another life or death fight at Salamanca. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then why not consider supporting us by joining our amazing Patreon community. Not only do you get exclusive access to full-length virtual battlefield tours from throughout history, but your support is quite literally essential to allow us to produce content just like this. So if you have a few moments, please do check it out. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.